The chamber was cold, sterile. The fluorescent lights above cast an unforgiving glare over the rows of lawmakers seated in tense silence. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that comes before a storm. Whispers floated through the room, punctuated by the occasional rustle of papers and the sound of shoes tapping nervously against the marble floor. Harriet Hageman stood just outside the chamber doors, her hands tightening around the notes in her hand. Her heart was racing, but her expression remained calm. Years of training had taught her how to mask her emotions. This wasn't about her, it was about the truth. A sharp knock on the door behind her. Jim Jordan stepped inside, his suit slightly wrinkled from the long session. His eyes narrowed as he walked toward her. "Are you sure about this?" Jim's voice was low, cautious. Harriet smiled faintly. "If I wasn't, would I be standing here? This is dangerous." Jim's tone sharpened. "You know what they'll do to you if you push this too far. Schiff isn't just another congressman. He's got people in high places backing him. Powerful people." "Good." Harriet's eyes flashed cold. "That means I'm on the right track." Jim sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You don't have to do this alone." "I know." Harriet adjusted the lapels of her blazer. "But this part? I need to do it myself." Jim hesitated before handing her a small, folded piece of paper. "This was left in my office this morning." Harriet unfolded it. Just 3 words, scrawled in rough ink. "Keep quiet, or else." She snorted. "Amateurs." Jim leaned closer. "This isn't a game, Harriet. They're not going to just let you walk out of this chamber after what you're about to say." "I know." The doors to the chamber creaked open. The speaker's voice rang out. "Representative Hageman will now take the floor." Harriet gave Jim a final, lingering look. Then she stepped inside. Adam Schiff sat at the center of the chamber, his arms folded over his chest. His face was a mask of calm. But Harriet could see it, the subtle twitch of his jaw, the rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the desk. He knew what was coming. Harriet reached the podium. She adjusted the microphone, letting her gaze sweep across the chamber. The Republicans sat in tense readiness. The Democrats sat back, some of them smirking, others coldly indifferent. She took a breath. "Mr. Speaker," she began, her voice steady but sharp. "I stand before you today not as a member of a political party, but as a representative of the American people. And I have a duty to speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth may be." A murmur rippled through the room. Schiff's eyes narrowed. "I take my duties seriously. And part of that duty is holding my fellow representatives accountable, especially when they lie to the American people." The room stilled. Even the smirks on the Democratic side faded. "There's a sickness in this chamber," Harriet continued, her voice hardening. "A sickness that festers when lies are treated as truth, when political power becomes more important than integrity. And at the center of it all," she turned her gaze directly toward Adam Schiff, "is Adam Schiff." Schiff's expression didn't change, but his hands stopped tapping. "Representative Schiff," Harriet said, "stood at this very podium and told the American people that he had proof of Russian collusion. He claimed that our sitting president was guilty of treason. He told us that there was a smoking gun, evidence that would damn the president and justify the investigations that cost this country millions of taxpayer dollars." She paused. The silence was deafening. "He lied." Gasps erupted from the Democratic side of the chamber. Some lawmakers leaned forward, their mouths open. Harriet's gaze remained fixed on Schiff. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. And even when the evidence proved him wrong, he doubled down. He fed the American people a false narrative. And he did it knowingly. Schiff's jaw twitched. "And for what?" Harriet's voice sharpened. "To undermine an administration? To weaken our democracy from within? Or was it just for political gain?" A loud bang of the speaker's gavel. "Order." Harriet smiled coldly. "I'll yield the floor when I'm finished." "Mr. Speaker." Schiff leaned back in his chair, his face expressionless. But Harriet saw it, the tension in his neck, the stiffness in his posture. He was calculating his next move. "I have proof," Harriet said, "direct proof that Schiff fabricated evidence. That he used his position as chairman of the Intelligence Committee to mislead the American people. And I'm prepared to show it." More gasps. Schiff's hand tightened on the armrest of his chair. "But first," Harriet's gaze hardened, "I have a question for you. Representative Schiff." She leaned forward. "When you told the American people that you had evidence of collusion, did you even bother to check if it was true?" Schiff's mouth twitched. He leaned forward, gripping the desk. His voice was low, measured, careful. Representative Hageman. Harriet smiled. Or what? She stepped back from the podium as the chamber erupted into chaos. Shouts. Angry voices from both sides. Adam Schiff stood slowly, adjusting his tie. His eyes met Harriet's, cold and sharp. He smiled faintly. Your move. Harriet's eyes narrowed. Oh, Congressman. She turned and walked away from the podium. This is just the beginning. The noise in the chamber hadn't fully settled. The speaker's gavel had echoed through the room. But the murmur of voices and shifting of bodies continued beneath the surface like the low growl of a storm still gathering strength. Harriet stood at her desk, eyes fixed on Adam Schiff. He hadn't moved. His hands were still pressed flat against the polished wood of his desk. But his jaw was tight, and his lips had thinned into a pale line. She wasn't finished. Harriet stood, adjusting the microphone again, her expression hard. Mr. Speaker, she said, her voice cutting through the lingering noise. I request permission to continue. Representative Hageman, you have the floor. Harriet stepped back toward the podium, the sound of her heels echoing through the chamber. She felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her. Some expectant, others suspicious. She ignored them all and focused only on Schiff. Let's revisit the timeline, shall we? Harriet's tone sharpened. Representative Schiff publicly stated on no fewer than 16 occasions that he had direct evidence of collusion between President Trump and the Russian government. She reached into a thin folder and pulled out a stack of papers. CNN, January 23 Road, MSNBC. February 3 Road, The Washington Post. March 12. Schiff claimed he had seen the evidence himself. That it was just a matter of time before the American people would see it too. A low hum of voices from the Republican side of the aisle. Harriet saw Jim Jordan leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, a thin smirk tugging at his lips. On the Democratic side, the postures were less relaxed, rigid, defensive. And yet, Harriet continued, flipping through the papers. When the Mueller report was released, the findings were clear. There was no evidence of collusion. None. Schiff's hands curled into fists. His mouth opened slightly, just enough to suggest he was about to speak, but Harriet cut him off. Did you misread the report, Representative Schiff? Harriet's voice was dangerously calm. Or were you lying to the American people? A sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the chamber. Schiff finally stood, adjusting his tie. His voice, when it came, was measured and cool. Representative Hageman is engaging in dangerous rhetoric. Answer the question. Harriet's voice sliced through his like a blade. Did you lie? Schiff's jaw tightened. I acted in the best interests of the American people, using the intelligence available at the time. Oh, please. Harriet rolled her eyes. Intelligence available at the time. Are you seriously suggesting that the Steele dossier, an unverified, politically motivated document, constitutes credible intelligence? Schiff's mouth twitched. Harriet saw his eyes flick toward the Democratic side of the aisle, where Speaker Pelosi sat stone-faced, watching the exchange with cold detachment. You built an entire case on a foundation of lies. Harriet pressed. You misled this chamber. You misled the American people. And you weaponized your position as chairman of the Intelligence Committee to fuel a political witch hunt. Schiff smiled faintly. Your interpretation of events is. No, Representative Schiff. Harriet leaned forward. It's not an interpretation. It's a fact. Schiff's smile faded. He opened his mouth again. But Harriet turned to the speaker. Mr. Speaker, she said, I would like to enter into the record the public statements made by Representative Adam Schiff between January and March of 2019. Objection. A Democratic representative shouted from the left side of the aisle. Overruled, the speaker replied. Harriet handed the stack of papers to a clerk, then turned back toward Adam Schiff. Care to explain those statements, Representative? Harriet asked, her tone deceptively mild. Schiff's smile was gone now. He leaned slightly toward his microphone. My actions were based on the intelligence provided to me by our national security agencies. Which agencies? Harriet shot back. Classified sources. Harriet folded her hands behind her back. Convenient. A low laugh from the Republican side of the chamber. Schiff's eyes narrowed dangerously. This is beneath the dignity of this chamber. Schiff said. Representative Hageman is engaging in conspiracy theories. The only conspiracy here, Harriet interrupted, is the one you orchestrated. And I have the receipts. Schiff's mouth twitched. He was no longer smiling. Harriet could feel the tension in the room climbing. She was pressing the blade deeper now. Drawing blood. Representative Schiff, Harriet said, her voice low and cutting. You claim to have seen direct evidence of collusion. So where is it? Schiff's mouth opened, then closed. His hand gripped the edge of his desk hard enough that his knuckles widened. Let me save you the trouble of answering. Harriet said. It doesn't exist. It never existed. The room exploded. Shouts from the Democratic side of the aisle. Outraged voices rising. The speaker hammered the gavel repeatedly. Harriet remained standing, unmoved, while Schiff sat frozen, his mouth drawn into a thin line. Jim Jordan leaned toward Harriet, his mouth close to her ear. You've got him. Harriet smiled faintly. Not yet. Schiff's eyes locked onto hers. Careful, Representative Hageman, he said softly. You don't know how deep this goes. Harriet's gaze didn't waver. Oh, I think I do. A single sharp knock echoed from the chamber doors. A clerk entered, whispered something to the speaker, and handed him a document. The speaker's eyes widened slightly as he scanned the paper. Representative Hageman, the speaker said, there has been a new development. You're going to want to see this. Harriet's eyes narrowed. Adam Schiff sat back in his chair, the faintest trace of a smirk returning to his lips. Interesting, he murmured. Harriet took the paper from the clerk and unfolded it. Her stomach dropped. What is it? Jim asked. Harriet's mouth tightened. It's a subpoena. Jim's expression darkened. For who? Harriet's eyes lifted toward Schiff. For me. The subpoena lay heavy in Harriet's hands, the crisp white paper stark against the polished mahogany of her desk. The words were cold and precise, a formal order demanding her appearance before the House Ethics Committee. The implication was clear. Schiff had fired back. Jim Jordan sat across from her, his brow furrowed as he scanned the document. He dropped it onto the table with a sharp exhale. This isn't a warning, it's a declaration of war. Harriet's eyes remained fixed on the paper. Her mind was already calculating the next steps. It's not unexpected. Jim leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Schiff controls the committee. He'll paint you as unhinged, as reckless. He'll question your credibility, your motives. Let him. Harriet's voice was cold. Harriet. She looked up, her eyes like steel. He's trying to scare me. He wants me to back down. And what if he succeeds? Jim's gaze darkened. He won't. Jim rubbed the back of his neck. You're walking into a trap. Maybe. Harriet's expression hardened. But if I don't walk in, who will? Jim's mouth pressed into a thin line. You know he's got more than this. He wouldn't pull the trigger unless he was sure he could bury you. Then I guess I'll have to bury him first. 2 days later, the committee hearing. The House Ethics Committee chamber was smaller than the main congressional floor. But the tension was just as palpable. Harriet sat alone at a long table, the subpoena resting beside her like a loaded weapon. Across from her, Schiff sat with a team of lawyers and aides, his expression carefully composed. He looked relaxed, too relaxed. Representative Hageman, the chairman began, we are here today to address allegations of misconduct. Specifically, that you have engaged in reckless accusations without credible evidence, and that you have misused your platform to spread misinformation. Harriet smiled thinly. I take it this is a formal inquiry? Correct. Then let's dispense with the pleasantries. The chairman's lips twitched. Adam Schiff leaned forward, his eyes glinting. Representative Hageman has publicly accused me of lying to the American people, an accusation that carries serious weight. Because it's true. Harriet's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Schiff's smile didn't falter. I assume you have evidence to support such a dangerous claim? Harriet reached into her folder and pulled out a series of transcripts. January 2019, CNN. You stated unequivocally that you had seen direct evidence of collusion. March 2019, MSNBC. You repeated that claim. May 2019, The Washington Post, again. The same claim. She slid the papers across the table. 3 years of public statements. 3 years of claiming you had evidence, and yet the Mueller report, released under bipartisan oversight, found nothing. I was acting on the intelligence provided to me. Schiff's tone was calm, measured. From who? That information is classified. How convenient. A murmur rippled through the committee. Schiff's mouth twitched. Let's not waste time on theatrics. Adam Schiff said smoothly. Representative Hageman's accusations are based on conjecture and personal bias. Personal bias? Harriet's eyes narrowed. Let me make this very simple. Either you lied, or you were lied to. So which is it? Schiff's smile thinned. He leaned back in his chair. This is beneath the dignity of this chamber. So is lying to the American people. Harriet shot back. The chairman raised a hand. Representative Hageman, we're not here to discuss Representative Schiff's record. We're here to address whether you have acted recklessly in your accusations. Harriet's jaw tightened. She leaned forward. If holding a member of Congress accountable for misleading the American people is considered reckless, then perhaps we should be rethinking the standards of this chamber. You're not answering the question. Neither is he. A tense silence followed. Schiff's eyes glinted dangerously. Representative Hageman, Schiff said softly, you seem to think you've exposed me. But you're mistaken. You've walked directly into the trap I set for you. Harriet's eyes narrowed. Care to elaborate? Adam Schiff smiled thinly. He pulled a folder from his own desk and opened it. Allow me to present Exhibit A. A clerk handed the papers to the chairman, who adjusted his glasses as he scanned the contents. His brows furrowed. What is this? Harriet demanded. Evidence. Schiff's voice was deceptively mild. A financial transaction from February 2020. A donation made to your campaign by a known Russian oligarch. Gasps from the committee. Harriet's mouth tightened. That's a fabrication. The financial records say otherwise. Schiff's gaze sharpened. Surely you wouldn't suggest that the Federal Election Commission is also lying? Harriet's blood turned to ice. Jim Jordan stood. This is a setup. Is it? Schiff's smile widened. Because according to the paperwork, Representative Hageman received $250 from an account linked to Russian intelligence. Harriet forced her breathing to steady. That's impossible. And yet, Adam Schiff said, there it is. Jim stepped toward Harriet. We can fight this. We'll challenge the source. No need. Harriet's voice sharpened. Because I know exactly what this is. Enlighten us. Schiff's voice was mocking. Harriet stood slowly. This isn't about me. It's about control. You knew I would expose you. So you created a false trail. A planted story. Manufactured evidence. Prove it. Schiff's smile was predatory. Harriet leaned forward. Oh, I intend to. Schiff's smile faltered. Just for a second. Mr. Chairman, Harriet said, her voice cutting across the room. I formally request access to the original source of these financial records. If Representative Schiff is so confident in their authenticity, surely he won't object to an independent audit? Schiff's jaw tightened. I'll take that as a yes. Harriet said. The chairman hesitated. I'll need to confer with the committee. You do that. Harriet's smile was cold. And while you're at it, maybe ask Representative Schiff where exactly he got those records. Schiff's face darkened. His smile was gone now. Jim leaned close to Harriet. What's the plan? We find the source. Harriet's gaze sharpened. If Schiff forged this, he didn't do it alone. Someone helped him. And when you find them? Harriet's smile returned. We burn it all down. Schiff's gaze followed her as she left the room. His eyes cold and calculating. Careful, Representative, he called after her. You're not the only one who knows how to play dirty. Harriet didn't even turn around. Let's see who plays it better. The night was cold. The air had that metallic bite that came with late winter. Sharp enough to cut through Harriet's coat as she stepped out onto the quiet street. Her heels clicked softly against the pavement as she walked toward her car. Parked beneath the dim glow of a streetlight. Jim Jordan followed close behind. His hands shoved deep into his pockets. He glanced over his shoulder. Eyes narrowed. This doesn't feel right. It's not supposed to. Harriet unlocked the car, glancing toward the darkened street. That's the point. Jim sighed. So, what now? Schiff just accused you of taking money from the Russians on live television. You think the press is going to let that go? Let them talk. Harriet opened the car door. The truth will outlast their headlines. Jim's expression hardened. Schiff's not working alone. Harriet, someone fed him that financial report. Someone with access to high-level banking records. I know. Harriet's hand tightened around the edge of the car door. Which means there's a leak somewhere inside the government. Maybe even inside the Republican Party. Jim rubbed the back of his neck. You think Adam Schiff has allies in the FBI? Or the Justice Department? Or both? Jim exhaled sharply. Jesus. Harriet's eyes darkened. We're not dealing with a political scandal anymore. We're dealing with a machine. Jim opened his mouth to respond, but then he froze. Harriet. His voice sharpened. Harriet frowned. What? Jim's eyes were fixed on the darkened alleyway across the street. A figure was standing there, tall and motionless. A hooded jacket concealed their face. They were watching. Get in the car, Jim said quietly. Harriet's eyes narrowed. No. The figure began walking toward them. Slowly. Harriet. I'm not running. Harriet stepped away from the car, squaring her shoulders. Hey, she called out. You want something? The figure didn't answer. Jim reached inside his jacket. Harriet heard the click of metal as he drew a concealed handgun from his side holster. Stop right there, Jim ordered. The figure slowed, then stopped about 10 feet away. The glow from the streetlight barely touched the edges of his face, a pale chin, thin lips, dark stubble. Representative Hageman, the man said. His voice was low, calm. Who are you? Harriet demanded. That's not important. His tone sharpened. What matters is that you're getting very close to dangerous territory. Jim's hand tightened around his weapon. State your business or I'm calling Capitol Police. The man smiled faintly. The police work for us. Harriet's blood turned cold. Us? The man stepped closer. Harriet could see his eyes now, dark and hollow. You think Adam Schiff is your enemy? He said softly. He's just a piece of the board. The game is much bigger than him. Who sent you? Harriet's voice was steady, but her pulse was hammering in her ears. I'm just a messenger. Then deliver your message. The man's smile widened. Back down. Stop digging. Walk away from this. Or what? Harriet's gaze was ice. Or you'll be the next one buried. Jim's gun shifted slightly. You got 3 seconds to walk away. The man smiled, raising his hands in mock surrender. You've been warned. Then he turned and disappeared back into the shadows. Jim kept the gun raised for several seconds, his chest rising and falling in sharp breaths. Harriet. I'm fine. Harriet's gaze remained fixed on the darkened alleyway. That guy wasn't bluffing. No. Harriet's voice was cold. He wasn't. So what's the plan? Jim's voice was tense. Harriet exhaled slowly. We double down. Jim's eyes widened. You can't be serious. I'm not backing down. Harriet's gaze sharpened. Adam Schiff isn't the threat. He's just the face of it. The real power is still in the shadows. And now, she opened the car door, sliding inside. I know exactly where to start looking. Jim slid into the passenger seat, glancing toward the darkened street. You realize they might kill you for this? Harriet smiled faintly as she started the engine. Then I guess we'd better make it count. The next morning, Capitol Hill. The committee chamber was nearly empty when Harriet arrived. The press had already begun circling the scandal. Headlines splashed across the morning news. Harriet Hageman tied to Russian money laundering? Republican firebrand under investigation. Schiff strikes back. Harriet pushed through the reporters, ignoring the questions shouted at her from every direction. Representative Hageman, did you accept money from Russian sources? Do you have proof Schiff fabricated the evidence? Are you planning to resign? She reached the elevator and stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor. As the doors slid shut, Harriet's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered it without hesitation. Harriet Hageman, you're persistent. It was the same voice from last night. Calm, amused. What do you want? Harriet's voice sharpened. I told you, this is bigger than Adam Schiff. If you keep digging, you'll find out exactly how deep it goes. Is that supposed to scare me? A soft laugh. No, it's supposed to warn you. Warn me about what? About the consequences of knowing too much. Then why call me? Harriet's gaze darkened. Because someone wants you to know. Who? The line went dead. The elevator doors opened. Harriet stepped into a hallway lined with closed office doors. A man in a dark suit waited for her at the end of the corridor. He smiled politely. Representative Hageman? Harriet nodded. Director Wray will see you now. Harriet's gaze sharpened. FBI Director Christopher Wray. What does he want? To discuss your financial records. Harriet's pulse quickened. Lead the way. She followed the agent down the hall, her mind already turning. Schiff wasn't the target anymore, he was the bait. And Harriet was getting closer to whoever was holding the strings. The office of the FBI director was cold and clinical. The walls were painted in shades of gray. The furniture was minimalist and sterile, exactly the kind of environment designed to make a person feel small. Harriet sat in a black leather chair across from a wide, polished desk. Director Christopher Ray sat on the other side, his expression composed, almost bored. Behind him, the large windows overlooked the Washington skyline, the gray clouds pressing low against the city. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of her. She didn't want it. Representative Hageman, Ray said, his tone polite but distant. Thank you for coming. Harriet's eyes narrowed. You didn't really give me a choice. Ray's mouth twitched slightly. We don't typically issue subpoenas without cause. Oh, right. Harriet leaned back in her chair. That's why I'm sitting here. Instead of Adam Schiff. Ray's gaze didn't change. This isn't about Representative Schiff. It should be. Ray slid a thin folder across the desk. Harriet didn't reach for it. That's a detailed report from the Financial Crimes Unit. It shows a transfer of $250 from an offshore account registered to a known Russian operative directly into your campaign fund. Harriet's jaw tightened. It's fabricated. Is it? Ray's tone remained perfectly even. I'm not going to sit here and explain how easy it would be for someone with the right connections to plant that kind of evidence. Harriet's voice sharpened. And you know that. Ray folded his hands on the desk. Perhaps, but the records check out. The banks confirm the transaction. If you expect me to dismiss this as coincidence, I expect you to do your job. Harriet interrupted. And if you don't, I'll find someone who will. Ray's gaze sharpened. Are you accusing the Bureau of complicity? I'm saying that Schiff is being protected. The question is, by who? A flicker of something, too quick to name, passed through Ray's expression. He leaned back, his gaze never leaving hers. Be careful, Representative Hageman. There are forces at play here that you don't understand. Harriet's eyes narrowed. Then explain it to me. Ray stood, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. If I could, I would. Bullshit. Harriet stood, planting her hands on the desk. You're not protecting Adam Schiff. You're protecting whatever's standing behind him. Ray's gaze darkened. If I were you, I would walk away from this. If you were me. Harriet's voice was ice. You'd already know that's not going to happen. Ray's mouth pressed into a thin line. In that case, he stepped toward the door. Opening it, a pair of agents in dark suits were waiting outside. We're not done here. Oh, I know. Harriet turned and walked toward the door. Before stepping out, she glanced back at Ray. Next time, Director, try harder. Capitol Hill. That evening, Jim Jordan was waiting in Harriet's office when she arrived. He was leaning against her desk, arms crossed, his expression dark. How did it go? Jim asked. Harriet dropped her coat onto the back of her chair. As expected, Ray knows what's happening, but he's not going to stop it. Jim's eyes narrowed. Why not? Because he can't. Harriet's voice was cold. This is bigger than Schiff. Ray's compromised. Or at the very least, his hands are tied. Jim rubbed the back of his neck. So what now? Harriet moved toward her desk and opened a locked drawer. She pulled out a thin file, a copy of the financial records Adam Schiff had produced during the hearing. She tossed it onto the desk. We track the money. Jim frowned. You think it's real? No. Harriet's voice sharpened. But someone created it. If we can figure out where it originated, we'll know who's backing Schiff. Jim picked up the file and flipped through it. This account is registered to a bank in Zurich. Start there. Jim hesitated. If this is a setup, if we push too hard. We've already pushed too hard. Harriet's gaze darkened. There's no going back now. Jim was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You trust me? Always. Jim nodded. Okay, let's burn it down. Later that night, Harriet's apartment. The knock came at exactly 2 a.m. Harriet sat up in bed, her hand already moving toward the handgun in the nightstand. She padded toward the door, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. Who is it? She called. It's me. Harriet frowned and opened the door. Jim stood there, but he wasn't alone. A tall, dark-haired woman in her early 40s stood beside him, dressed in a black trench coat. Her expression was cool, professional. Who the hell is this? Harriet demanded. She's the one who gave Schiff those financial records. Jim's voice was hard. Or at least, that's what she told me. The woman stepped inside, glancing around the apartment with clinical detachment. My name is Rebecca Cole. And why should I trust you? Harriet's voice was sharp. Rebecca's gaze sharpened. Because I'm the one who planted the evidence. Harriet's breath stilled. You expect me to believe that? Believe what you want. Rebecca's voice was cold. But you're out of time. Harriet's eyes narrowed. Explain. Rebecca stepped toward the window, her reflection barely visible in the glass. Schiff isn't your problem. He's the distraction. From what? Rebecca turned, her expression hard. From the intelligence operation that's been running in the shadows since 2016. Harriet's pulse quickened. What kind of operation? A full-scale domestic surveillance program. Illegal, hidden beneath layers of classified authority. The Steele dossier was just the beginning. Adam Schiff was used to push it into the public narrative. Who's behind it? Rebecca's gaze darkened. The intelligence community. Select factions of the NSA, FBI, and CIA. They've been using Schiff to control the political landscape, controlling narratives, manufacturing crises, and undermining administrations. For what purpose? Harriet's voice sharpened. Power. Rebecca's eyes glinted. They don't care about politics. They care about control. Harriet's hands curled into fists. So why are you telling me this now? Rebecca smiled faintly. Because they've decided to sacrifice Schiff. Why? Because you got too close. Harriet's pulse hammered in her ears. And you're helping me because. Rebecca's smile faded. Because you have one shot at stopping this. And if you fail, then what? Then this country belongs to them. The room was dimly lit. The only illumination coming from the muted glow of the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Harriet sat at a sleek black table in a private office in downtown Washington. Across from her sat Rebecca Cole, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Jim Jordan stood by the window, arms crossed, his face shadowed beneath the cold light of the street lamps. Rebecca's face remained carefully neutral, but Harriet could see the flicker of tension behind her eyes. The woman was trained, military or intelligence. Probably both, but Harriet had spent enough time dealing with operatives to recognize the cracks beneath the surface. Let's start from the beginning, Harriet said, her tone clipped. You said Schiff was part of an intelligence operation. Explain. Rebecca's gaze sharpened. In 2015, the Steele dossier was commissioned as opposition research. It was supposed to be political ammunition, nothing more. But then the intelligence community got involved. Why? Jim's voice was cold. Rebecca's gaze darkened. Because they saw an opportunity. The narrative about Russian interference was the perfect cover for expanding surveillance operations, domestically and internationally. Harriet's eyes narrowed. You're saying the collusion narrative was a front? Rebecca nodded. The intelligence community used the dossier to justify expanded FISA warrants, to target specific political figures, and to open doors to surveillance programs that would otherwise have been illegal under the Constitution. And Adam Schiff? Harriet leaned forward. Schiff was recruited. Rebecca's voice was steady, but Harriet saw the tension in her jaw. Not directly. He was fed selective intelligence, enough to make him believe he was uncovering a massive conspiracy. He genuinely thought he was acting in the interest of the country. Bullshit. Harriet's voice sharpened. He's too smart not to know he was being manipulated. He knew, Rebecca admitted, but once the story gained traction, it became politically useful, and by then, he was too deep to back out. Jim's eyes narrowed. So why sacrifice him now? Rebecca's mouth tightened. Because Harriet started asking the wrong questions. Schiff became a liability. Harriet's pulse quickened. So they planted evidence against me to discredit me, and now they're going to let Schiff burn for it. Rebecca's eyes darkened. Correct. And the intelligence community? Harriet's voice sharpened. Rebecca hesitated. Then she said, they'll close ranks, distance themselves from Schiff, frame it as a rogue operation, a case of political overreach. Schiff will take the fall, and the machine will keep turning. Harriet's hands curled into fists. So they win. Unless you stop them. Harriet's gaze sharpened. How? Rebecca's expression didn't change. By exposing the operation. Not just Schiff, but the architects behind him. You mean the NSA? And the Department of Justice? Rebecca's gaze sharpened. And the National Security Council? Jim's jaw tightened. That's a hell of a list. They built the narrative, Rebecca said. They pushed it through back channels. They used Schiff as a mouthpiece. But they controlled the narrative from the beginning. And you can prove that? Harriet's voice sharpened. Rebecca's smile was cold. I can give you the names. I can give you the money trail. But you'll need to get it into the record. That's not going to be easy. It never is. 2 days later, Capitol Hill. The hearing room was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled. The press had gathered in full force. cameras positioned to capture every moment. Harriet sat at the head of the Republican side of the aisle, her hands resting on the polished wood desk. Jim Jordan sat beside her, flipping through a folder of documents. Schiff sat across from them. His face was calm, but Harriet could see the tension in his posture. His hands were too still. His jaw was too tight. The speaker's gavel slammed down. "This hearing will come to order." Harriet stood, adjusting the microphone. "Mr. Speaker, I would like to enter into the record new evidence pertaining to the Russian collusion investigation." "Objection," a Democratic representative called out. "Overruled," the speaker said. Harriet smiled faintly. She opened the folder. "This," she said, "is a classified intelligence memo. It details how the Steele dossier was used to justify illegal surveillance warrants against members of the Trump campaign." Gasps from the gallery. Schiff's eyes narrowed. "These documents," Harriet continued, "show that Adam Schiff was briefed on the credibility of the Steele dossier as early as January 2017, and that he was advised by the National Security Council that the evidence was thin and unverified." Schiff's hands curled into fists. Yet despite knowing that the intelligence was unreliable, Representative Schiff publicly claimed, on multiple occasions, that he had seen direct evidence of collusion. Harriet slid the document across the table. "And this," she said, "is a financial trail, tracing campaign donations to Representative Schiff from a political action committee funded by firms connected to the intelligence community." Schiff's mouth tightened. "These records are authenticated." Harriet's voice cut through him. "I had them reviewed by an independent forensic investigator." Jim stood. "What Representative Hageman is saying, what this evidence proves, is that the collusion narrative was a manufactured political weapon. It was orchestrated not by a foreign power, but by factions within our own government." Gasps erupted from the gallery. Shouts from the Democratic side of the aisle. Schiff's face had gone pale. "Mr. Speaker," Harriet said, "I move for a formal investigation into the actions of Representative Schiff and his connections to the intelligence community." The speaker hesitated. "Do it," Harriet said. "Seconded," Jim added. The speaker's gaze sharpened. He leaned toward the clerk. "Proceed." Shouts erupted across the chamber. Schiff stood slowly, his face expressionless. He walked toward Harriet's side of the room. "You think this ends with me?" Schiff's voice was quiet. Harriet's smile was cold. "No, I think it starts with you." Schiff's mouth curled faintly. "Then you have no idea what you've started." Harriet's gaze didn't waver. "Watch me." That evening, Harriet's apartment. Harriet stood by the window, looking down at the city lights below. Her phone buzzed. She answered it. "Harriet Hageman, you made a mistake." It was the same voice from before, the man in the alley. Calm, controlled, enlighten me. Schiff was a sacrifice. I know. And now that you've forced their hand, they're going to move faster. Good. A low chuckle. You're out of your depth. Representative Hageman. Then I guess we'll find out how deep this goes. The line went dead. Harriet Hageman turned from the window. Her gaze cold. Let them come. The night was quiet, too quiet. Harriet sat in the back seat of a black sedan as it sped through the darkened streets of Washington, D.C. The city outside the tinted windows passed by in a blur of cold steel and glass. Street lights flickered and cast fractured patterns of light across the pavement. Jim Jordan sat beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed in concentration. Across from them sat Rebecca Cole, her expression impassive as she scrolled through a tablet. A thin blue light illuminated her face, giving her the appearance of a ghost. "Where are we going?" Harriet's voice cut through the silence. Rebecca's eyes flicked toward her. "Meeting with my contact." "Who?" "A source within the National Security Council." Rebecca's voice was calm. "Someone high enough to have access to the original orders authorizing the surveillance operation." "And you trust him?" Harriet's eyes narrowed. Rebecca's mouth curled faintly. "I don't trust anyone." Jim leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "How do you know this isn't a setup?" Rebecca's gaze sharpened. "I don't." Harriet's eyes darkened. "Then why are we going?" Rebecca's expression didn't change. "Because if we don't, we lose." The warehouse, 11:30 p.m. The car pulled into an abandoned warehouse district on the outskirts of the city. The pavement was cracked and stained with oil. Faded graffiti marked the sides of the buildings. The only light came from a single security lamp flickering above the entrance of a rusted steel door. Rebecca stepped out first, adjusting the collar of her trench coat. Harriet Hagman and Jim followed, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. "How much time do we have?" Harriet Hagman asked. "Enough." Rebecca's voice was cold. "Unless they already know we're here." "Reassuring," Jim muttered. Rebecca led them through the steel door and down a narrow hallway. The concrete walls were stained with age and dampness. Somewhere in the distance, the hum of industrial ventilation created a low, pulsing sound. "We're here," Rebecca said. She opened a door at the end of the hallway. Inside was a single metal table beneath a bare light bulb. A man sat there, his back toward them. He wore a gray suit, the collar slightly frayed, his hands folded on the table in front of him. "You're late," the man said without turning around. Rebecca stepped inside. "Traffic." The man turned. He was older, mid-50s, with thinning gray hair and dark circles beneath his eyes. His face was lean, almost gaunt, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Representative Hagman," he said. His voice was smooth, controlled. "I've been expecting you." Harriet sat down across from him. "Who are you?" "That's not important." "I disagree." Harriet's gaze sharpened. The man smiled faintly. "I work for the National Security Council. Or at least, I used to. And what do you have for us?" Rebecca's voice was cold. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. He set it on the table between them. "This contains the original orders." Harriet's eyes narrowed. "Orders for what?" "The surveillance operation." The man's expression darkened. "FISA warrants. Intelligence reports. Chain of command orders authorizing the operation. Signed off at the highest levels." "Names?" Harriet Hagman pressed. The man's gaze sharpened. "Director of National Intelligence. Secretary of Defense. Deputy Director of the FBI." Jim's eyes widened. "Jesus. This goes beyond Schiff," the man said. "Schiff was just the front man. The cleanup crew. And you're giving us this because—" Harriet's voice was low. The man's mouth twitched. "Because the operation is still active. And it's about to get worse." "Worse how?" The man's expression darkened. "The surveillance operation wasn't just about Trump. It was about control. They've been gathering leverage on members of Congress. On private industry. On foreign governments. The Russian collusion narrative was a distraction. A way to justify the expansion of those powers without public oversight. And now?" Harriet's voice sharpened. "Now they have enough material to destroy anyone who stands in their way." The man's gaze darkened. "Including you." A low hum filled the room. Harriet's gaze sharpened. "What is that?" Rebecca's eyes widened. "Shit." The hum intensified. A thin red dot appeared on the center of the man's forehead. "Get down," Rebecca shouted. The glass window behind them shattered as the first shot ripped through the room. Harriet hit the floor, rolling behind the table as bullets tore through the concrete walls. Jim dove toward her, dragging her behind cover. Rebecca drew a handgun from beneath her coat and fired toward the shattered window. A dark figure moved across the catwalk above them. "Sniper," Rebecca shouted. The man at the table was slumped forward, blood leaking from the hole in his forehead. "He's gone," Jim shouted. Rebecca fired 2 more shots. The figure on the catwalk vanished into the shadows. "Move." Rebecca grabbed Harriet Hagman's arm and pulled her toward the door. Jim fired toward the window, covering them as they ran. They barreled down the hallway, Harriet's breath hammering in her chest. Rebecca yanked open the steel door. Outside, 2 black SUVs were already pulling into the lot. "They were waiting for us," Harriet said breathlessly. "No shit," Rebecca growled. Jim's gun was still raised. "How do we get out?" Rebecca's eyes flashed cold. "We don't." The SUVs screeched to a stop. 4 men in tactical gear stepped out, rifles raised. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She raised her weapon and fired. The first man dropped. Jim opened fire, hitting the second in the leg. Harriet ran toward the nearest SUV. The third man fired. Harriet felt the bullet whistle past her shoulder. She slammed into the SUV, yanking open the driver's side door. "Harriet," Jim shouted. She grabbed the gearshift and twisted the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. Rebecca fired again, dropping the last man. "Get in," Harriet shouted. Jim and Rebecca dove into the SUV. Harriet slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The tires screamed as the vehicle shot forward. Bullets sparked against the side panels. "Who the hell were those guys?" Jim shouted. Rebecca's gaze was ice. Not Schiff's people. Harriet's eyes narrowed. Then who? Rebecca's mouth tightened. The people Schiff works for. Harriet's pulse hammered in her ears. And now? Rebecca's gaze sharpened. Now they know you have the evidence. Harriet's jaw tightened. Good. The SUV roared down the street. The headlights cutting through the dark. Now it's my turn. Harriet sat alone in her office. The flash drive resting on the desk in front of her. A single piece of plastic and metal, barely the size of her thumb, and yet it held enough information to bring down the most powerful men in Washington. The file Rebecca had handed her contained everything, signed FISA warrants. Emails, text messages, financial transactions, all of it led back to the intelligence community. NSA, CIA, FBI, DOJ, they were all involved. The Russian collusion narrative had been manufactured, not by foreign actors, but by the very agencies entrusted to protect the country. Schiff was just the public face of the operation, a useful idiot manipulated into playing his part. The real architects were still in the shadows, still in control. Harriet leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming against the desk. The choice in front of her was simple, but the consequences were enormous. Release it, Jim said from the doorway. Harriet glanced toward him. He stood with his arms crossed, his face shadowed beneath the dim glow of the office lights. You think it's that simple? Harriet's voice was low. It is that simple. Jim stepped forward. We have the evidence. We take it to the press. We take it to the committee. And then what? Harriet's eyes sharpened. You think they'll just roll over and let this happen? You think the people who orchestrated this operation, the people who control Congress, the courts, and the intelligence agencies, are going to let the truth come out? Jim's jaw tightened. We have to try. Harriet's gaze darkened. Schiff was a pawn. You take out a pawn. The board doesn't change. You want to win this? We need to take out the king. Then we take it to the people. Jim's voice sharpened. Harriet's mouth curled faintly. No. Jim frowned. No? Harriet's eyes narrowed. We don't take this public. What? We don't take this public, yet. Harriet leaned forward. The people who orchestrated this have built their power on secrecy and fear. If we expose them, they'll regroup, they'll protect themselves, and in 6 months, they'll have another pawn, another operation. Jim's eyes narrowed. Then what's the plan? Harriet's gaze sharpened. We bait them. Jim's brow furrowed. Bait them how? Harriet's mouth curled faintly. We make them think they've won. The next morning, Capitol Hill. Harriet Hageman entered the chamber, her heels echoing against the marble floor. The gallery was packed, journalists, political operatives, staffers. The buzz of conversation quieted as she approached the podium. Schiff sat at the center of the Democratic side of the chamber, his face carefully composed. Behind him, Speaker Pelosi sat rigid, her expression cold and calculating. Harriet Hageman could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes watching her. Waiting. Representative Hageman, the speaker said. You requested the floor? Yes, Madam Speaker. Harriet's voice was calm. She pulled a single sheet of paper from her folder and laid it on the podium. I rise today to address the ongoing investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. Schiff's mouth curled faintly. The evidence presented to this chamber was, in fact, accurate. Harriet continued. Gasps rippled through the room. Excuse me? Jim hissed from the Republican side of the chamber. Harriet's gaze didn't waver. The intelligence presented to Representative Schiff was credible. The connection between foreign operatives and the Trump campaign was real. Schiff's smile widened. Pelosi's eyes flashed with amusement. However, Harriet continued, what this chamber was not told is the scope of the intelligence operation behind that information. The room went still. Schiff's smile faded. The Russian collusion narrative was not the product of foreign interference, Harriet said. It was the product of a domestic intelligence operation. Schiff's eyes narrowed. This operation, Harriet continued, was designed not only to influence an election, but to consolidate power within the highest levels of government. The intelligence community used fabricated evidence, unauthorized surveillance, and political manipulation to create a manufactured scandal, one that was intended to undermine the legitimacy of the presidency and expand the power of federal agencies beyond constitutional limits. Shouts erupted from the Democratic side of the chamber. The speaker slammed her gavel. Order. Harriet didn't even blink. Her gaze remained fixed on Schiff. Representative Schiff was briefed on this intelligence. He was told that the Steele dossier was unreliable. He was told that the evidence was politically motivated. And yet, he stood before this chamber, before the American people, and lied. Schiff's hands curled into fists. He lied, Harriet repeated, her voice cutting through the noise. Because he was ordered to. By who? Schiff's voice was sharp. Harriet's gaze didn't waver. By the National Security Council. By the Department of Justice. By the very agencies entrusted to protect this country. You have no proof of this. Schiff growled. Harriet Hageman smiled faintly. Actually, I do. She held up the flash drive. This contains the chain of command orders. Direct authorizations for the FISA warrants. Communications between the intelligence community and members of this chamber. Schiff's face paled. And more importantly, Harriet's voice sharpened. It contains the financial trail connecting political action committees to intelligence-linked firms that funded this operation. Schiff stood abruptly. Madam Speaker, this is outrageous. Sit down. Adam, Harriet said coldly. Your turn is over. Pelosi's eyes narrowed. Representative Hageman, you are making accusations of criminal misconduct. No, Madam Speaker, Harriet said. I am presenting evidence. Pelosi's gaze sharpened. And what exactly do you expect this chamber to do with this evidence? Harriet's smile darkened. Your job. The room exploded into noise. Pelosi hammered her gavel. Harriet stepped away from the podium and walked toward Jim. What happens now? Jim asked. Now? Harriet's gaze sharpened. Now they'll come for us. And when they do? Harriet's smile was cold. We'll be ready. That night, Harriet's apartment. Harriet stood at the window, looking down at the city lights. Her phone buzzed. Harriet Hageman, you've made a mistake. It was the same voice as before, calm. Detached. Have I? You pushed too far. Good. You think you've won? Harriet's smile sharpened. I think I've started something you can't stop. We'll see. Yes, Harriet said softly. We will. She ended the call and slipped the phone into her pocket. Outside, the dark city stretched beneath her feet. The machine was moving now. The architects behind the operation wouldn't let this go. They would push back. But Harriet Hageman wasn't afraid anymore. The truth was out. And now, it's their turn to run. The storm hit fast. Less than 24 hours after Harriet's bombshell testimony, the political landscape shifted violently. News channels blazed with headlines that shook Washington to its core. Adam Schiff implicated in national security scandal. Congressional hearing exposes widespread surveillance operation. Intelligence community under investigation for domestic spying. The morning after the hearing, Harriet found herself sitting in a secure conference room inside the Capitol. Jim Jordan sat across from her. Exhaustion etched into his face. The documents from the flash drive lay scattered across the table. Evidence that had shattered years of secrecy in a matter of minutes. We did it, Jim said softly. His voice held little triumph. No, Harriet said grimly. We started it. FBI headquarters, same morning. Adam Schiff sat in a cold interrogation room. His hands folded tightly on the table. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his face pale. Across from him sat Christopher Wray, the FBI director himself. We can contain this, Wray said, his voice low. Schiff shook his head. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Wray's voice hardened. This isn't just about you. This is about the entire system. If they uncover everything, they already have. Schiff's voice was hoarse. Wray leaned forward. Then fix it. How? Schiff's voice cracked. Harriet Hageman has the evidence. She's already gone public. You think I can spin this? You think I can convince the country that I wasn't part of this? Wray's face turned cold. Then maybe we don't need you anymore. The words lingered in the air like smoke. Schiff swallowed hard. You're saying I'm expendable. I'm saying. Wray's voice sharpened. If you want to survive this, you'll do exactly what I tell you to do. That evening, Harriet's office. The evening news blared in the background as Harriet Hageman sat at her desk. Scrolling through her inbox, messages poured in, supporters, journalists, friends. The country was in turmoil. And Harriet was at the center of it. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Harriet answered. Harriet Hageman. The voice was calm, familiar. It's me. Rebecca? Listen carefully. Rebecca's voice was tight with urgency. They're coming for you. Harriet's pulse quickened. Who? The cleanup crew. What do you mean? I mean, Schiff isn't your problem anymore, Rebecca said. The people behind him, they know you're a threat now. They're not going to risk letting you walk away from this. What are you saying? Harriet's voice lowered. I'm saying there's a kill order out on you. The ambush. Jim Jordan's SUV roared down the empty streets of D.C. Harriet in the passenger seat and Rebecca in the back. They know where you live, Rebecca warned. They know where you work. You're out of options. I'm not running. Harriet Hageman shot back. You're not listening. Rebecca's voice rose. These aren't politicians. These aren't lawyers. These are professionals. Harriet, operatives trained to erase threats. If you don't disappear for a while, they're going to kill you. Jim clenched the steering wheel tightly. We'll figure something out. The glare of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Two black SUVs turned onto the road behind them. We're being followed, Jim muttered. They're not following, Rebecca said darkly. They're hunting. The lead SUV surged forward. Harriet caught the glint of something metallic. Down, Rebecca shouted. Glass shattered as bullets ripped through the back window. Jim swerved violently as one of the SUVs slammed into their rear bumper. The vehicle skidded across the road. Harriet braced against the dashboard. Take the next turn, Rebecca barked. Jim spun the wheel hard, narrowly avoiding a collision as their SUV roared down a narrow side street. The second SUV followed close behind. They're boxing us in, Harriet yelled. Jim slammed the brakes and spun the wheel hard. The SUV fishtailed, then surged forward again. The pursuing vehicle overshot the turn. We're clear, Jim breathed. No, Harriet said tightly. This isn't over. The confrontation. They pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a hotel. Harriet climbed out, her pulse still racing. We can't keep running, Harriet said. Rebecca stepped closer. You're not hearing me, Harriet. This isn't just politics anymore. They're going to kill you. Let them try. Harriet's voice was steel. That's suicide. No, Harriet said firmly. It's justice. Rebecca's face softened slightly. Then you'd better finish what you started. The final blow. The next morning, Harriet stood once again before the full chamber of Congress. The tension was palpable. News crews packed the balcony, and members of both parties sat in tense silence. Adam Schiff sat quietly, his face pale and drawn. He wasn't fighting anymore, he was waiting for the inevitable. Mr. Speaker, Harriet said into the microphone, I rise today with one final statement. The room held its breath. The intelligence agencies behind this conspiracy believed they could manipulate democracy from the shadows. They believed they were untouchable, that they could silence anyone who stood in their way. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. They were wrong. Harriet Hageman held up the flash drive. I'm delivering this to the Department of Justice for immediate review. And if there's any justice left in this country, the people responsible will face the consequences of their actions. Epilogue. The price of truth. Days later, Adam Schiff resigned from Congress. Criminal charges followed. The public learned the extent of the surveillance operation, how the intelligence community had manipulated public perception, used elected officials as pawns, and worked to consolidate power at the highest levels. But Harriet knew the war wasn't over. One evening, as she sat in her office, her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. She answered. Harriet Hageman. The same cold, calm voice spoke. You think this is finished? No, Harriet said softly. Good, the voice replied. Because neither do we. The line went dead. Harriet Hageman leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The machine was still out there. Still powerful. Still dangerous. But now, they knew one thing for certain. She wasn't afraid of them anymore.